I almost didn't go that day. It was one of those gray London mornings where the clouds look like they can't decide whether to rain or just hang there and make everyone miserable. My shoes were wet from the night before. The tube had been delayed twice. And honestly, Buckingham Palace wasn't even on my original plan for the trip. I'd been to London before, done the tourist thing, seen the gates, taken the photos. But my cousin Marcus had never been first time in Europe, first time outside the States, and he wanted to see the guards. He kept saying it like a kid. I just want to see those guys in the big hats. So we went. It was a Tuesday, early November. That specific kind of cold that doesn't scream at you, it just creeps. The sort of cold you don't notice until your fingers stop working properly and you realize you've been standing still for 20 minutes. We got off at St. James's Park station and walked up through the park itself, past the pelicans, past the joggers who seemed completely unbothered by the temperature, past the little lake that looked like a painting even on a bad weather day. By the time we reached the front of the palace, there were already a few dozen people gathered. Not the enormous summer crowds, this was November, off-season, but still. Tourists with cameras, a school group in matching yellow vests, a couple sharing a thermos of something hot, a man in a long coat standing completely alone near the gate, not taking any photos, just watching. I noticed him almost immediately. That's the thing about people who are completely still in a crowd of movement. Your eye finds them without meaning to. But I didn't think much of it then, not yet. The guards at Buckingham Palace are positioned at several points, the sentry boxes, the main gate, the side entrances. Everyone always focuses on the ones in the sentry boxes, and you can understand why. They're striking. That's the only word for it. The red tunic, the black bearskin hat, the polished boots that somehow manage to look immaculate even when the pavement is damp and gray. They stand at absolute attention, rifle at their side, eyes fixed on something no one else can see. The guard on duty that morning, I'll call him what the badge near his post identified as his regiment, the Coldstream Guards, was young. I assumed young. It's hard to tell age under all that uniform, but something about his posture, the particular way he held himself, reminded me of someone not long out of adolescence. There's this thing that young men do when they're trying very hard to project authority, a slight overcorrectness to the spine, a jaw set just a fraction too deliberately. He had that. He was posted at the left sentry box, the one that catches more direct foot traffic from tourists walking along the forecourt railing, which meant he caught more of everything, more cameras, more people waving, more people testing the limits of how close they could get before the posted signs became genuinely relevant. Marcus pulled out his phone immediately. Classic. He took about 11 photos in the first 3 minutes, circling slowly like he was photographing an ancient artifact. I stood back a bit. I developed this habit in crowds of finding a slightly raised spot or a less congested angle, somewhere I could see the whole scene rather than just the immediate foreground. That's how I saw what happened next. It started small. Everything real always does. There was a woman, early 60s maybe, with the kind of silver hair that looks intentional rather than just gray, wearing a dark green wool coat, who had separated slightly from the main cluster of tourists. She wasn't doing anything alarming. She was just standing closer to the sentry box than most people tend to drift, not crossing any lines, not touching anything. Just standing there with this expression on her face that I couldn't quite read from where I was. It wasn't curiosity. It wasn't amusement like most tourists. It was something else. The guard hadn't moved. Obviously, they don't. That's the entire point. Eyes forward, body perfectly still, breathing controlled, whatever they're taught it holds. Even when people wave directly in front of their faces. Even when children try to make them laugh. Even when the wind picks up and everyone else pulls their collars tighter, the guard stands there like he's carved. But the woman, she wasn't trying to make him react. She wasn't doing any of that. She was just looking at him, steadily, the way you look at something when you're thinking about something else entirely. After about a minute, she opened her handbag. Now, this made a few people nearby glance over. There's always a low-level surveillance happening in tourist spots, people keeping half an eye on anything that seems slightly out of pattern. She pulled something out, and for a second I genuinely couldn't see what it was from my angle. She held it in both hands for a moment. Then she stepped forward just slightly, just barely within what seemed like the acceptable margin, and she placed it on the ground, right at the edge of the sentry box step, carefully, like she was placing something on an altar. Then she stepped back, and she just stood there again, looking at him. I moved to get a better angle. It was a small paper bag, the kind bakeries use, white, slightly crinkled at the top like it had been folded and refolded. It sat there on the stone step, looking utterly incongruous next to the rigid formality of everything around it. A few tourists had noticed. Not many, but a few. The school group was distracted by something their teacher was explaining further down the forecourt. Marcus was still taking photos, blissfully unaware of any of this. The man in the long coat, the one I'd noticed earlier standing very still, had shifted slightly. He was watching the woman now, not the guard. The guard had not moved. But here's the thing, and I want to be careful about how I describe this because I know how it sounds. Something about his stillness changed. It's almost impossible to explain. He didn't move. His posture didn't shift. His eyes didn't drop to the bag. Nothing visible happened. And yet, there was something in the set of his shoulders, some infinitesimal adjustment so small it barely registered, that made me feel like he had somehow acknowledged what she'd done. Or maybe I imagined it. I've gone back and forth on that. The woman waited another moment. Then she gave a small nod to no one, really, or maybe to him specifically, and she turned and walked slowly away from the gate, back toward the park. She didn't look back. I watched her go. And then I looked back at the bag sitting on the step. And then I looked at the guard. And something about that whole 30 seconds sat in my chest, in a way I couldn't immediately explain. About 20 minutes passed. The school group moved on. The couple with the thermos left. The crowd cycled through in that way crowds do, some people drifting away, new ones arriving, the general shuffle of tourism. Marcus had finally put his phone away and was now complaining that he couldn't feel his left ear. The bag was still there. I'd been watching it off and on, the way you watch something you're pretending not to watch. I was curious. Obviously. It's a paper bag left at a royal guardsman's post by a quietly emotional older woman. Of course I was curious. A tourist, American, young, baseball cap with some university logo walked past the sentry box close enough to notice the bag. He looked at it, looked at the guard, looked back at the bag, then kept walking. Another woman stopped, tilted her head at it, seemed to decide it wasn't her business and moved on. Nobody touched it. Which in retrospect makes perfect sense. There's an invisible field around those sentry boxes, an unspoken rule that you don't disturb the perimeter of the guard's space. People feel it even without being told, even without reading any signs. You don't touch things there. It's not fear exactly. It's respect maybe, or something adjacent to respect. But the bag stayed, and the guard stayed, and the whole thing had this strange, suspended quality to it. Then Marcus appeared at my elbow, breathing into his cupped hands for warmth, and he said, because Marcus has the observational timing of a golden retriever, "Hey, what's that bag?" I started to say I wasn't sure. And that's when the man in the long coat moved. He'd been standing near the railing this whole time. I'd clocked him at the beginning and then half forgotten about him in the way you do with background details. Middle-aged, I'd say now, somewhere between 50 and 60. The coat was dark navy, well worn but cared for, you know the difference. It had seen years, but it had been looked after. He had a close-trimmed beard going white at the edges, and he walked with a very slight hitch on his left side. Not dramatic, just a barely perceptible thing. Like an old injury that had healed mostly, but not entirely. He walked toward the sentry box with a deliberateness that immediately made the nearby tourists shift aside. Not that he was aggressive or large or intimidating. He wasn't any of those things. There was just something about the way he moved that made space open up ahead of him, a certainty in the step. He stopped just outside the invisible boundary line. Everyone observes without being told. He looked at the paper bag on the step. He looked at the guard. The guard was still immovable, eyes forward, everything still. The man in the navy coat reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out, and I actually laughed quietly to myself when I saw it, not mockingly, but in the surprised way that catches you, a second paper bag. Same style, white, folded at the top. He stood there holding it for a moment. Then, very carefully, he placed it on the step beside the first one. Marcus grabbed my arm. "Wait, what is happening?" I had absolutely no idea. Here's what I knew about the changing of the guard at that point. Almost nothing. I mean, I knew the broad strokes. The ceremony happens, one regiment replaces another, there's marching and music, and it draws enormous crowds in the warmer months. But I didn't know the specifics, the timing, the duration of a sentry's post, what exactly the protocol looked like from the inside. I was a tourist, a well-meaning but uninformed one. What I didn't know, what I only found out later, talking to a woman near the gate who turned out to be a retired civil servant and apparently a font of information about palace protocol, was that the guards on duty in November work extended posts. In the summer, with larger crowds and more public ceremony, the rotations are more frequent. But on quieter mornings in the off-season, a sentry can be standing at that post for quite a long stretch, an hour, sometimes more. In the cold, in the damp, without moving. I thought about that, really thought about it, standing still in that coat and that hat, while the temperature sits just above freezing and the moisture in the air settles on everything, while tourists walk past taking your picture like you're an exhibit, while children try to make you blink, while the world does its ordinary Tuesday things around you and you just hold. There's discipline in that which is almost incomprehensible to the average person. I know people say it all the time. "Oh, I couldn't do that. I'd laugh. I'd sneeze. I'd lose my mind," but they say it lightly. The way you comment on something impressive without really sitting inside the reality of it. I sat inside it that morning, at least a little. And suddenly, the paper bags on the step made a different kind of sense. After the man in the navy coat placed his bag, he didn't leave immediately. He stepped back to the appropriate distance, and he stood there. Not in the restless, phone-checking way most people stand in tourist spaces. He stood the way the guard stood, not identically, not with any military precision, but with a similar quality of intention, like he had decided to be somewhere and he meant it. A few tourists had stopped to watch now. Nothing dramatic, nobody was filming yet, nobody had made a fuss. It was more like a ripple of quiet attention moving through the small crowd, people sensing that something was happening without quite knowing what. Marcus was gripping my elbow. He does this when he's excited. It's mildly painful. The guard hadn't moved, but the two white paper bags sat there on the stone step like two small question marks. Then a little girl, couldn't have been more than 5 or 6, red coat, the kind of wispy blonde hair that goes in every direction, detached herself from whoever she was with and toddled right up to the sentry box. Every nearby adult tensed. You could feel it. She looked up at the guard with the completely unfiltered directness that small children have, no self-consciousness, no social calibration, just pure looking. Then she looked down at the two bags. She reached out a tiny hand toward them. "Rosie," a man's voice, sharp and quiet. Her father or someone moved quickly and scooped her up before she touched anything. She didn't cry, just looked momentarily confused. He carried her away, murmuring something, giving an apologetic glance to no one in particular. And then something unexpected happened. One of the guards further down the forecourt, not the one at the sentry box, but a different one who was doing a slow, measured patrol walk, made his way toward the box. This was apparently a normal thing. Marcus asked me later why the other guard was walking, and I had to explain that there are multiple guards on duty and they have different roles. But in the moment, his approach toward the box shifted the atmosphere noticeably. He stopped near the sentry box, exchanged some kind of brief. Eyes forward communication with the standing guard, looked at the bags on the step, looked at the man in the navy coat who was still standing there. A pause. Then the patrol guard turned and walked back the way he came. And nothing happened, and that was somehow everything. Because what it meant, what that small non-event communicated, was that the bags were not a threat. They were not being treated as suspicious. The system had noticed, assessed, and allowed. The kindness was permitted to stay. I needed to know what was in the bags. That probably sounds terrible, but I think anyone standing there in that gray November morning with wet shoes and a cousin squeezing their elbow would have felt the same way. There's something almost unbearable about a small mystery that is also clearly tender. You want to protect it and understand it at the same time. I didn't get close enough to see inside them. I was too far away, and honestly I felt like crossing that space would have been wrong in some way I couldn't fully articulate. But the retired civil servant, whose name, she told me, was Patricia, and who had clearly decided that I was a reasonable person to talk to, possibly because I was the only other person standing still for more than 3 minutes, filled in some of what I was missing. She'd been watching too, from a slightly different angle. She'd seen the woman in the green coat arrive before I had. She came from St. James's Street, Patricia told me, in the matter-of-fact way of someone who pays attention to things. Walked very purposefully. She had the bag when she arrived. "Do you know what's in it?" I asked. Patricia smiled slightly. Hand warmers, I'd imagine, or something similar. I blinked. "In November," she said, as if this were the most obvious thing in the world. "Standing out here in this." She gestured at the cold air around us with a small movement of her gloved hand. Hand warmers. I turned it over in my mind. Someone had walked to Buckingham Palace on a cold Tuesday morning in November carrying hand warmers for a man who, by the nature of his duty, could not use them, could not reach down and pick them up, could not acknowledge them, could not say thank you, could not even glance at them. She brought them knowing all of that. She'd left them anyway. That's the moment I stopped being a casual observer and started being someone who was genuinely moved by what I was watching. Because think about the architecture of that gesture. It wasn't performative. There was no audience she was playing to. She'd arrived, done it quietly, and walked away. She didn't wait to see if anyone noticed. She didn't post anything. She didn't take a photo. She'd done it in the particular way of a person who does a thing for the sake of the thing, with no need for the loop to close. And here's what made it complicated and beautiful at the same time. It was a gesture of care directed at someone who was forbidden from receiving it. The guard couldn't pick up the bags. He couldn't put the hand warmers in his gloves. He couldn't acknowledge the warmth of the gesture, even if the literal warmth was right there at his feet. The entire protocol of his duty prevented him from doing anything with the kindness except stand near it. And she had brought them anyway. Marcus, beside me, had gone completely quiet, which, for Marcus, is approximately as rare as a total solar eclipse. He was looking at the bags on the step with an expression I hadn't seen on him the entire trip. I nudged him. "You good?" He didn't answer for a second. Then, "That's really something, man." "Yeah, I thought it really is." The man in the navy coat was still there. By this point it had been probably 40 minutes since the woman in the green coat had placed her bag. The crowd around the gate had fully cycled at least twice, new tourists arriving, others leaving, the school group long gone. The sky had shifted from gray-white to a darker, more committed gray that suggested it was finally making its decision about rain. I went over to him. I don't usually do that. I'm not the type to approach strangers in public places and start conversations about things I've been watching them do. I'm too aware of how it can come across, too conscious of people's right to be left alone. But something about the morning had eroded my usual reticence. The whole atmosphere of the thing had done something to the normal social barriers. I stopped about a meter away from him, which is the politely British distance even though I'm not British, and I said something like, "I saw what you did, with the bag." He looked at me, not startled. He'd probably noticed me watching, as people notice things when they're genuinely paying attention to their surroundings. "Did you?" "Yes, did you know her, the woman who came before you?" A small pause. "No." "But you brought the same thing." He looked back at the guard, at the bags, at the small space of stone step that had become something. "Not exactly the same," he said. "Then, I saw her do it, went to the shop on the corner." He tilted his head back toward the direction of Buckingham Palace Road. "Took me about 15 minutes. I processed that." He had seen the woman leave the bag, and he had walked to a nearby shop, bought something, not the same thing necessarily, but something in the same spirit, and come back to add it, within the same morning, while the guard was still on duty. "Why?" I asked, which was probably too direct, but there it was. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that I've been thinking about ever since. "My son did 8 years, he said. "Not here, different regiment." That was all he said about it. He left about 10 minutes later, the same careful way he'd arrived, with that slight hitch in his left side. I watched him go until he was past the gate and into the park, and then he was just a navy coat among the trees. Marcus appeared at my side again. "Who was that?" "A father," I said. Marcus thought about that, nodded slowly. "Okay," he said. The bags were still on the step. The guard was still standing. The wind had picked up slightly, carrying that particular London smell, damp stone, exhaust from a passing bus somewhere behind us, something almost metallic that might have been rain coming. And then, just then, as if the morning had decided to give one more thing before it closed, the guard moved. Not in the way people expect when they watch the guards hopping to see a reaction, not a flinch or a break. This was authorized movement, controlled movement. He brought the rifle up in a precise, formal motion and turned in a careful, measured arc, the full rotation of a posted sentry doing what posted sentries do at certain intervals, the formal acknowledgement of continued duty. His eyes swept across the forecourt, across the small crowd, across the gate, across everything. And just for a fraction of a second, or maybe I am imagining this. Maybe I have been constructing this in the weeks since. His gaze passed over the 2 white bags at his feet. Nothing changed in his face, nothing broke. But that gaze passed over them. And somehow I felt, completely irrationally and completely certainly, that he knew they were there. That he had always known. That the whole morning, the woman in the green coat, the man with the limp and the navy coat, the little girl in red who'd reached out a tiny hand, all of it, had been seen by him from within his stillness, held within it as he held everything. He completed his turn, came back to forward position, went still again. The rifle came back to rest. It started raining just before noon. Not dramatically. London rarely does anything dramatically with weather. It's more of a slow, administrative process, rain arriving the way paperwork arrives, steadily and without apology. First you notice the pavement darkening in patches, then your jacket starts to feel heavier, then you admit it. We'd been at the palace forecourt for nearly 2 hours by that point. I hadn't intended to stay that long. Marcus hadn't intended to stay that long. But there's something about witnessing something you can't fully categorize that roots you to the spot. You keep thinking, is there more? Is this the whole thing? Should I stay another minute? We stayed another minute, and then another. Patricia, the retired civil servant, had bought a coffee from somewhere. I didn't see her leave and come back. She simply materialized with it. And she was standing near me again, sipping it with the satisfaction of someone who had nowhere to be and knew it. The guard had changed. At some point during the preceding half hour, the rotation had happened quietly, efficiently, with none of the fanfare of the summer ceremony. A new guard now stood in the sentry box. Same uniform, different person. And here was the thing that caught in my throat like a small bone. The bags were still there. Not disturbed, not removed, still sitting on the stone step, slightly darker now from the damp in the air. 2 white paper bags at the foot of a sentry box, in the rain, at the side of Buckingham Palace. The new guard was standing over them, or rather, they were at his feet. Whatever they contained, they were part of his post now too. He'd taken up his position and they had been there, and he had begun his duty with them present, as if they were part of the architecture. Which maybe, for that morning, they were. I want to try to explain something about the feeling of that moment, because this is the part I keep returning to when I think about that day. The part that resists clean description. There is a specific quality of kindness that does not require reception. Most kindness has a transaction at its center, even when we don't want to admit it. I do a kind thing, you receive it, something passes between us, the circuit closes. And that's not bad. Most kindness is like that. It's warm and necessary and human. But occasionally you encounter a kindness that refuses the transaction. That gives without any mechanism for receiving. That exists purely in the act of giving, with no return address, no completion, no closing of the loop. The woman in the green coat. She had walked from wherever she came from. I never found out. I never saw her again, carrying hand warmers for a man who could not use them while she watched. For a man who was not allowed to acknowledge her. For a man whose entire duty was a kind of extraordinary, chosen absence of self, standing so still, so present in his post, that he becomes less an individual and more an idea. The idea of duty, the idea of service. The idea that some people will stand in the cold, and the damp and the gray, so that others don't have to. She had walked up and placed warmth at his feet. And walked away. That's it. That's the whole story in miniature. And somehow it contains everything I want to say about it and nothing I can quite articulate. Marcus, to his enormous credit, asked the right question. We were walking away by then, finally, the rain having graduated from mist to genuine intention. He had his hands jammed in his pockets and his collar turned up, and he'd been quiet for a while. Then he said, "Do you think he'll ever know, the guard, I mean, that people did that for him?" I thought about it. "I think he knows," I said. "In the moment, whatever his training is, whatever they're taught to focus on, there's still a person in there. People always know when they're being seen. But does he know why?" And that one I didn't answer, because I wasn't sure. Does he know that the woman in the green coat is someone who maybe had a son, or a husband, or a nephew, or simply a deep and private reverence for what he represents? Does he know that the man in the navy coat went to a shop on the corner and came back within 15 minutes because his own son had stood posts like this one and he understood bone deep, not abstractly, what that costs a person? Does the guard know that a little girl in a red coat tried to reach out and touch the bags and was scooped up by her father before she could? And that the gesture of that tiny reaching hand was its own kind of salute?